This is Module 5B of the 19th Century Transformation of Western Medicine. This will be a short and final module. In this final module, we're going to talk about how Koch's discovery of the bacillus that causes tuberculosis radically changed the public's perception of the disease, and how before this discovery, most people called tuberculosis by the name consumption. Then after 1882, when Koch made his discovery of the bacillus, the name of the disease changed to tuberculosis. Now, of course, they are the same disease, they just went by different names in the public. So the disease that we today call tuberculosis um, was conceived or thought of quite differently depending on the period of the 19th century that we're talking about. And this difference in understanding and conceptualization of the disease had nothing to do with the symptoms of the disease. Because, of course, whether you called tuberculosis consumption or you called it tuberculosis, it had the same disease, it had the same morbidity and mortality rates. It was the public perception, the social understanding of the disease that changed. Now, consumption is what tuberculosis was called prior to 1882. And consumption was considered to be a very romantic and mysterious disease. It was a disease that was thought to be um, heritable. You had a susceptibility to the disease, and it was often associated with genius and glamour. That idea of the disease consumption changes dramatically after 1882 when Koch discovers the tuberculosis bacillus. After his discovery, tuberculosis becomes understood as just a nasty germ, and the association of the disease changes to an association with filth and poverty and overcrowding and tenement housing and overcrowded workshops. So the social and medical understanding of the same disease changed dramatically after the discovery in 1882 that it was caused by a bacillus. So, as I was saying before, people believed before 1882 that tuberculosis was an inherited trait, it was an inborn susceptibility, and it could be brought on by romantic excess or sadness or drama in your life. It really was the emo disease of the early 19th century. Now, history abounds with these emo representations of consumption in the early 19th century. And some of these things may look familiar to you. You probably have all heard of Victor Hugo's Les Miserables and Puccini's opera La Bohème, which was remade in the 1980s as Rent. So if any of you have ever seen Rent, that's actually the same play as La Bohème. Um, Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights. Um, in all of these plays and books and operas, the protagonists, the main characters, were usually women who were dying a slow, tragic, romantic death from consumption. You can also see a painting there by one of the Pre-Raphaelite painters, um, and you see this woman who honestly looks like a corpse. And this becomes a sort of like romanticized uh, notion of what a beautiful woman looks like, that she's almost corpse-like, that she's tubercular or dying of consumption. Here are a few more examples from the Romantic era. We have Lord Byron, who of course died of consumption, and we have his poem here. For the angel of death spread his wings on the blast and breathed in the face of the foe as he passed, and the eyes of the sleepers waxed deadly and chill, and their hearts but once heaved and forever grew still. See, I told you it was emo. We also have Toulouse-Lautrec's painting here of young woman at a table, and you see she has this very sort of skinny pallor about her, and if she's not as if she's not pale enough, what she has in front of her there is a container of rice powder that women would put on their faces to look even more death-like. You see also here the Muse model, Elizabeth Siddal, and a picture of her husband, who was the poet Rossetti. Um, so the Romantic era, which encompassed the entire first half of the 19th century, centered very much around the idea of the consumptive patient. Now, the idea of consumption shifts very rapidly after 1882, and forevermore, the disease is known as tuberculosis, which is a nasty disease, a nasty germ that's associated with filth and poverty and mucus and spit. So everything sort of disgusting that you can think of. Um, it's remarkable how this view of the same disease just really changes overnight. TB, tuberculosis, is now thought of as a disease that's linked with crowded, unhygienic housing, poor ventilation, child labor, lower resistance due to poor diet, poor nutrition, and pre-existing diseases. It's associated with slums and tenements, industrial workers, prisons, barracks. So you can see how dramatically this idea of shifting from consumption to tuberculosis happens in the latter half of the 19th century. Again, I just want to reiterate that consumption and tuberculosis are, of course, the same disease. It's just the social understanding of the disease that changes after the date of 1882. And you can see here in these pictures how there's this deathbed scene with this slow, glamorous death from consumption. And this sort of becomes a sort of nasty, squalorly death in a tenement housing that's just caused by some random germ, tuberculosis. Um, Also, I wanted to note how tuberculosis is very different from cholera in that although cholera was the most feared disease of the 19th century, tuberculosis was the disease that killed the largest number of people. Um, I would say that the reason that cholera was the most feared disease was because of the hideous death that occurred with cholera. It wasn't in no way could falling down in the street and dying of diarrhea. There's no way that that could be somehow construed as a slow, glamorous death, as tuberculosis, when it was thought of as consumption, could have been. So one of these diseases was the largest killer. The other one was the most feared killer. And they have very different perceptions in the psyche of people of the 19th century. So here I'm just offering you a recap of important themes that you should have gleaned from listening to these 5 modules over the course of the semester. I would hope that you have learned something about the Paris School of Medicine and the contributions that it made to medicine in the 19th century, the rise of the German school of laboratory science, the rise of the hospital, which is very closely associated, of course, with the Paris School, the rise of physiology, and the changing understandings of the human body and how we go from a humoral galenic understanding of the human body that had been around for thousands of years um, to a physiological model that we would understand today if we looked at a 19th century textbook. Um, Another important theme, of course, cholera, tuberculosis, and last but not least, this debate over what was the exact cause of the decline in mortality and morbidity over the course of the 19th century, which is the theme for your final essay.